were in Skull and Bones together. Coffin had been in the CIA and worked with them for a period of time. Anyway, so I went to see Coffin. He was a minister. And I said, I've been reading Paul Tillich, and, I do have an ultimate concern. And, I went on and on. He said, and I'm not going to do him justice here. So we get to the conclusion. I'm not going to do him justice. And I might today disagree with him if this is in fact what he said. But he said, as I remember, he said something like, look, you have to understand, do you believe that there was such a figure as Jesus of Nazareth? I said, yeah, I accept that. And he said, and do you accept much of the rest of the story? And I said, I accept the fact that he was crucified. And, as for the resurrection, I don't know. But he said, all right, well, the one thing that you have to think about is this person was making claims. He was making claims perhaps verbally. Again, I think that's somewhat disputable if you set John aside, but he was making claims verbally, and he was making claims by virtue of his behavior. And he died as a consequence of doing that. So he at least earned the right to have his mission taken seriously. And you have to decide whether you believe in that and in him. And he would have elaborated on this. So I walked out of there, and I finally just tried to confront as best I could whether, in fact, I believed in God, whether I believed that there was such a thing as a resurrected Son, whether I believed that there was a Holy Spirit. And Coffin forced me to face my own truth. And it's not something I wanted, but what he did was, in a way, release me into my own personal truth, finally. And I haven't regretted the path that I found myself on since then. And there is plenty to marvel at and to stand in awe of for me in this universe without a deity. Thanks. Yes?
Your mother and father took you to church and dropped you off. Explain that dynamic a little bit, because that's a very unusual setup. I mean, most people that want their children to go to church go with them and try to share their thoughts and ideas. What led them to that sort of approach to you?
Does that say Bruce?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wish I could answer that. I wish I could answer that question. One of my regrets is that I didn't take the time to get to know my mom and dad. Kids grow up in a home and they take these people for granted, and they fail to ask them many of the important things that they should. If I had to say, I would say my father was reluctant to go to church. My mother was willing, but I don't think that they ever found an important part of church. I imagine for most people, is the community that it brings them. And I don't think that my mother, who was willing to go on holidays, ever really found the community that she would have been drawn to on a weekly basis. Yeah.
Yeah. I was in Vietnam for a while, and I'm just curious, in retrospect, how many, ballpark figure, how many people just didn't want to fight because they were going to die, and how many really were conscientious objectors for the reasons you just mentioned?
Alec, could you briefly repeat his question for everyone?
Right. So did you serve in the military in Vietnam?
I did, but I was a physician, so I didn't do contact.
Right. So the question was, could I say anything about how many people sought to resist the
So this gets to
touchy subject for probably both of us. I do not consider myself a draft evader. I don't know why this is. I don't consider myself a draft evader. I knew that there was a penalty. I was willing to pay that penalty. I haven't told you the rest of the story. I was willing to go to jail for 5 years rather than kill Vietnamese. And that's what we were doing there. But I saw, well, I think we just have to look at our previous president and his vice president to see people who did dodge the draft. And I knew I knew a guy who was training to use a bazooka because he thought we were going to have to fight the American military in the streets of this country. I knew a guy who left and went to Canada and has been there ever since. I know people who arranged with doctors to have themselves exempted from military service. But I mentioned William Sloane Coffin. He gave a sermon at which 1,000 young men turned in their draft cards, and Coffin sent these to the United States government. I think it would be impossible for me to guess at percentages in all of this. And all I would say is that every young man who lived at that point in time had a very difficult decision to make. And my roommate in college found a way of evading the draft, but he was married and he had a child. And so it was a very, very difficult time for everyone. I've already said my closest friend was in the United States military. He served in Vietnam. And he came back. He survived and came back. I can't probe into those manifold lives deeply enough to decide. How many people went into the military because they didn't want to go to jail. I'll take my chances. And there is the whole business of masculinity and what it means. Now, I think
How do you spell Coffin's last name, please?
William Sloane Coffin, Coffin.
Okay.
Yeah, and Sloane ends with an E. I'm sorry, I can't really tell you.
Okay. 2 more questions? One over here from Fleming.
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Sure.
I'm going to try to put 2 questions in 1 question.
I can't get too close to you because I'll start screaming.
2 good friends of mine, Dick Gregory and Muhammad Ali, were sort of protesting publicly about the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Muhammad Ali did not step across the line. He refused to step up to be drafted because he wanted to be a CO, but he had to go to court for 5 years, couldn't box anymore, etc. But he won in the Supreme Court the right to box again. Dick Gregory, on the other hand, just fasted and got a huge amount of people to follow him. He was my guest when I was at Cornell College when he had going to speak. But they were conscientious in their behavior for what they considered an unjust cause. To me, that's patriotism. You love your country enough to criticize it. Some decide to defend it militarily, some decide to criticize it, but they're both patriots, in my own opinion. I was being somewhat cornered because they were drafted by birthdays when I came along. So if your birthday was on February 23rd, for example, everybody born on February 23rd had to go down and you were 1A classified, you're not going for service. They reclassified me to 2C because I was going to college. But a lot of my cousins and friends from Vietnam, they came back with all kinds of issues. So I really applaud what you're doing and taking a position like that. My only question is this: how did your mom and dad respond to you once you became a conscious atheist?
Well, I didn't talk to them about this, but of course the whole business of my trials, because there were 2 of them, was evident to them. And my father had a very difficult time with it. I think I profoundly disappointed him, and but he lived through it. I think my mother was more sympathetic to what I had done. I didn't speak with them, as I guess I made clear to Bruce. We didn't talk about religion and what was going on inside us in that regard. So I don't know what they would have thought of my atheism. I think my mother would have been disappointed in that. you know, one of the saddest memories I have of this is you go into a court and it's when they call your case, and it's not dramatic at all. There are other cases that are being interrupted for a moment to deal with you, but they call it as the United States of America against Alan Williams, and it's an intimidating place to be. And my parents came to the first trial, and I saw them sitting back in the back of the courtroom, and they looked so small and so sad. You know, I felt very bad for them about this.
Last question.
Yeah.
I know you're a conscientious objector, and it might just be hard for you to respond. I'm not a conscientious objector, I certainly don't like war, but we're having this issue right now about gun control. And for me, yes, I know about the establishment of the militia and necessary. But part of the reason for having guns is to protect yourself against a possibly oppressive government. And I would just wonder about your thoughts on that.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, she was asking me, I think, tell me if I do you justice or if I don't. Her fundamental question, I think, is, aren't there times when it is necessary to protect yourself from people, and when it may be necessary to use whatever force is at your disposal to do that? Is that fair?
No, it was actually on the issue of gun control, because to me it seems like people are kind of missing the point, and that's what I said about the Constitution. Yes, to form a lawful, a lawful militia, but there are times in the whole Revolutionary War was against an oppressive government. And should you have a situation where people are clubbing, people who are protesting or firing on the students at Kent State, that sort of thing, I'm asking you and me to go beyond our position on violence to actually address the issue of gun control as a way, whether you agree with it, that the whole purpose of it as to protect against oppression by your own people.
Did you hear that?
This is a huge question. We're getting into gun control and a tyrannical government, etc. So maybe if I could just to allow us, because it's near the end, maybe just respond to the sort of original inclination you had about her question was, aren't there times when using extreme violence for a pacifist is the struggle? Which, are there ever times when the violence must be used? And maybe a brief answer to that, because we've run out of time. Is that okay? Okay with you? That's the best we can do.
Sure.
I'd be happy to talk with you perhaps another time. I guess I would just say, I think all of us are, well, if we're not Martin Luther King, we're not Mohandas Gandhi, I think we change if we go on thinking about the world and looking at it as closely and as carefully as we can. It's easy to be certain. It's easier to be certain when you're young, I think, than it is when you're old. And so my initial reaction would be, I don't know about the pacifism now. That was very important to me at that point in time, and I believed I was a pacifist. At this point in time, I'm not ready to say so confidently that I am an absolute pacifist. I do believe that violence generates violence, and whenever we use it, we have to be aware of that and take account of it. But there is such a thing. One of the 4 cardinal classical virtues is prudence, and that's knowing how to apply the other virtues in a particular situation. Well, thank you for your time.